Hail and well met, gentle beings of YouTube. I am the Social Justice Game Master, and I'm here to tell you about this one time that Sam Harris, who's like a 20th level rational mystic, somehow failed his wisdom saving throw and got hoodwinked by a racist troll. And yes, if this troll right here isn't a racist, then the word racist doesn't mean a damn thing. This is the story of a troll named Charlie. In the ancient days of yesteryear, the 1950s, Charlie was a sweet, soft, white teenager living in Newton, Iowa. Charlie was a good kid, a well-behaved, upstanding kid. But he was bored with life. So one day, he and his sweet, soft, white friends decided that they were going to start a gang. Because starting a gang, ironically, is what bored small-town kids did back then, I guess. Anyway, this wouldn't be an evil gang, not like the Sharks or the Jets or the Social Justice Warriors. No. Theirs would be a good gang of good kids, and they called themselves the Mallows, short for marshmallows, because marshmallows are soft and sweet and white. You see what they did there. Now, like any first-level adventuring party worth their salt, the Mallows wanted to make an impression on their town, and they decided that a prank would be the best way to get noticed. And out of all the many thousands of pranks they could have pulled, Charlie the Marshmallow Troll and his buddies decided it would be hilarious if they burned a cross on the hill next to Newton's police station. So they did. And just to be sure they got the credit for this awesome stunt, they spread a bunch of marshmallows on the ground all around that burning cross. Soft, sweet, white marshmallows. You see what they did there? I know you're in stitches, right? Who wouldn't be? Well, turns out the black families living in Newton at the time weren't in stitches. Actually, this stunt scared the hell out of them. And it pissed off a lot of other people in the town, too. Now, when Charlie learned about that reaction, he was completely baffled. How could anyone think that the Mallows, the sweet, soft, white gang of good kids, had any racist intent at all? Why, it was just an innocent prank. I mean, it's not like there were any evil gangs running around in 1950s America burning crosses to terrorize African Americans or anything. No, the idea to burn a cross had just come to the Mallows unbidden, like manna from heaven. They thought it all up on their own, and it only meant what they wanted it to mean. It doesn't matter what all of those other cross burnings meant. Couldn't people just see, based on who had done this cross burning, that this time it was completely innocent? When he was asked about his little cross-burning stunt 40 years later, Charlie said, "It never crossed our minds that this had any larger significance." Now, tone-deaf and naive, sure. But really, what else can we expect from a low-level local heroes tier party anyway? They're just beginning their careers. They still had like 20 whole levels of experience ahead of them. That's plenty of time to learn from their mistakes and possibly become true heroes. So in that spirit, Charlie went on an overseas adventure with the Peace Corps. Then he came home and attended wizard school at Harvard and MIT, where he earned degrees in history and political science. And he finally achieved national hero tier level in 1994, when he co-authored and published his magnum opus, a weighty, arcane tome on intelligence and class structure in America, rather blandly titled The Bell Curve. And just as with his innocent little cross-burning prank back in the 50s, Charlie's bold action here outraged tons of people, especially African Americans, and continues doing so to this day. And just like when he was part of that gang of soft, sweet, white teenagers called the Mallows, Charlie was completely baffled by the outrage, and he still is. Obviously, it must be that people just aren't paying attention to his actual work, or his actual character. I mean, Charlie insists that he is not a racist. Why can't we just take his word for it? He was one of the Mallows, after all, that gang of wholesome, well-behaved, upstanding, sweet, soft, white kids from Newton, Iowa. Shouldn't it just be obvious that they're not racists? Now, last year, Charlie went on a speaking tour, one of many he does throughout his life, and he got shouted down and assaulted by an angry crowd of protesters at Middlebury College. Now, personally, I think that's an indefensible way to handle this kind of troll, but I wasn't DMing this encounter, so we're just kind of stuck with the results. But things didn't turn out all bad for Charlie, though. This encounter actually leveled him up from national hero tier to plainer hero tier, because it brought him to the notice of the esteemed rational mystic Sam Harris, Slayer of the Gods. Godslayer Sam brought Charlie on his podcast and revealed the Marshmallow Troll's magic to a whole new audience of clear-minded acolytes. Clear-minded acolytes, that's what I mean. One of those clear-minded acolytes was me, your humble social justice game master. I had been a devotee of Sam Harris since he published The End of Faith, and it's safe to say that his work played a key role in shaping my own identity as a rational skeptic. So when Sam brought Charles Murray on his Waking Up podcast and defended not just Murray's free speech rights, but also his framing of scientific data about racial differences in IQ, I was more than a little confused. I mean, wasn't Charles Murray just some racist hack? That's what I'd always heard. So I'd never actually paid much attention to Charlie's work because I didn't think he deserved it. But now, here was my intellectual role model. My intellectual role model telling me that Charles Murray had been unfairly maligned. And it escalated from there. Sam got into a Twitter jousting match against Ezra Klein, the publisher of Vox.com, who himself had published an article by some intelligence researchers that accused Charles Murray, and by extension, Sam Harris, of racialist pseudoscience. Now, this, of course, made Sam Harris livid, and the tit-for-tat went on for almost a year, until Harris and Klein did a podcast together that just pissed everyone off in all camps. During this dust-up, at the end, I got a little wake-up call of my own. There was an acquaintance of mine on Facebook, not someone I knew well enough to call a friend, really, but someone whose opinion I respected nonetheless. And they made a post calling not just Charles Murray, but also Sam Harris, a bigot. And of course, I came to Sam Harris's defense, as I had many times before, expecting a protracted comment exchange in which we would come to some mutual understanding through the sorcerous powers of my pedantry and my skill at parsing public statements. But that is not what happened. My acquaintance simply killed the conversation by telling me not to come on their page anymore, and then they unfriended me. After I got over the shock of my acquaintance actually making a saving throw against my charm spells, I began to wonder, could my intellectual hero Sam Harris actually be wrong about something? Could he actually be a bigot? Now, I confess I'm still agnostic on that last question. If pushed on it, I would say no. It's a qualified no, but still, a no. Even after all the reevaluation and engagement with his critics I've done over the past few weeks, I still don't buy the claim that Sam Harris is a bigot. But I do think he was too easily snookered by a racist con man in the person of Charles Murray. And then he doubled down on his mistake to protect his ego. Now, I can empathize with that reaction. We all do it sometimes. But I really expected more from Sam here. I thought he was smarter than this, and more self-aware than this, even though the self is an illusion. I mean, after all, Sam has said on many occasions that he would be suspicious of the motives of someone who devotes time to studying racial differences in IQ. And yet, when in the company of just such a person, Sam displayed a total lack of suspicion, going so far as to defend Charles Murray as a legitimate scholar whose presentation of the data on racial IQ differences was entirely fair and neutral. Now, this is a strange thing to say about a man who does not have relevant expertise on the subject. Charles Murray is not a behavioral psychologist. He's not a cognitive neuroscientist. He's not even an evolutionary biologist with a passing interest in intelligence. He's basically a glorified political activist who's only interested in racial IQ data because of the way it bolsters his political agenda. Now, this should be transparently obvious to anyone who approaches his body of work objectively and rationally, something I think Harris failed to do, quite frankly. But it's what I tried to do, to the greatest extent possible. I went into this investigation biased in favor of Sam Harris, and by implication, Charles Murray. And because of my fondness for Harris and his skill at pedantry, I was willing to give Charles Murray the benefit of the doubt here. I tried to give everything I read by him or about him the most generous interpretation possible. And I still concluded that the consensus about him is right. Charles Murray is a racist. Full stop. And he's one of the worst and most destructive kinds of racist, too. The kind that thinks he isn't a racist at all, and is just being ganged up on unfairly. The kind whose posture of avuncular scholarship and bewildered neutrality lures other, more forthright racists out of the shadows and arms them with science to back up their stupid beliefs. The kind whose mask of innocence can fool even the highest level rational mystics, like Sam Harris, who's got to be like 20th level by now. I mean, the dude must have rolled with disadvantage and gotten a critical failure on this one. And yes, I did just say outright that Charles Murray is a racist. That is a conclusion I came to by taking a rational, skeptical look at the evidence, which I'm about to get into. But first, let's do the lawful good thing here and give an accurate summary of the bell curve so that we can see exactly what's wrong with it on its own terms.
Are people's life outcomes mainly determined by their intelligence? Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein believed that they are. Murray, a political scientist, and Herrnstein, a quantitative researcher, published The Bell Curve in 1994 to explore this idea. In it, they argued that over the population, a low IQ is a strong predictor of future poverty, criminality, and other negative outcomes. According to Murray and Herrnstein, IQ has more of an impact on these factors than a person's initial socioeconomic position. In turn, Murray and Herrnstein described intelligence as being sensitive to environmental and genetic factors. However, they believed that genetic factors were the most significant. Murray and Herrnstein argued that these causal relationships lead to the development of a cognitive elite. They believed that those with high IQs tend to associate mostly with each other. They attend similar colleges, have similar careers, and live in the same neighborhoods. They tend to partner with each other, continuing the pattern. Murray and Herrnstein argued that the U.S. education system did not reflect these differences in intelligence due to political correctness. They believed that education is dumbed down to support average children. Instead, it should seek to teach children differently according to their abilities.
The one relevant point that summary leaves out is Murray's presentation of the data on racial differences in IQ. That lies at the heart of this whole storm. Basically, Murray and his co-author Richard Herrnstein demonstrated that self-identified African Americans score lower on IQ tests on average than do self-identified white Americans. The average difference is about 15 IQ points, or one standard deviation from the mean. Now, by itself, this information, while troubling, isn't the problem with Charles Murray. It's entirely possible to accept this data at face value and discuss its ramifications and possible causes without demonstrating any hint of racism at all. But it's still at this point that some of Murray's critics get tripped up. They try to attack the data itself, insisting that the IQ test score difference isn't real. But as far as anyone working in the field of intelligence research can tell, it is. There are lots of hypotheses about why the difference exists and about what it means. But in terms of actual data about performance on IQ tests over time, the data really does show this difference, at least for now. And this is a point that Godslayer Sam belabored tirelessly in his clash with Ezra Klein. And on that narrow point, that data is just data, and we should all be able to handle it and talk about it like grown-ups, even if it makes us uncomfortable, Sam is right. We should. But that's a red herring, because the furor over Charles Murray isn't about his presentation of data. It's not about the fact that Murray just points out that this data exists. It never has been. The problem with Charles Murray, and the evidence that he's a racist, prepare yourselves, I'm about to get into it, comes in how he frames this data, how he talks about it, and in what he won't say about it. Murray's argument in the bell curve is that cognitive capacity, as measured by IQ, whether its underlying cause is genetic or environmental, and it's probably both, like most things about humans, is more or less unchangeable at both the individual and the population level. And further, that IQ predicts social outcomes and status far better than any other factor. Now, Murray says he doesn't endorse this state of affairs. In fact, he claims to be worried about it. But he does say it is more or less a consequence of intractable natural differences, and therein lies the main line of evidence against him on the charge of racism. If you plug these ideas into Charlie's political argument in the bell curve, namely that society stratifies by IQ, and the American educational system should, rather than trying to maximize everyone's potential, instead be restructured to teach different IQ levels in different ways, you should start to see the problem here. One of Murray's key concepts in the bell curve is that intelligence is a real, measurable trait of humans, and that it can be accurately measured by IQ tests that control for things like cultural and socioeconomic bias. Therefore, the disparity we see between blacks and whites on IQ scores isn't a bug, it's a feature. And we should restructure society to reflect that feature, so that low IQ black populations can thrive in tasks for which they are naturally suited, while higher IQ white, and okay, Asians too, populations can excel in higher education environments unhindered either by ponderous bureaucratic waste that's trying in vain to raise up dumb people, or by what Charles Murray calls flamboyant rhetoric about ethnic oppression. And by the way, my use of the word dumb right there wasn't a mistake. Murray explicitly refers to low IQ populations as dumb several times in the text of the bell curve, though his more usual phrase is lacking cognitive ability. So Murray's point in the bell curve with regard to race is that segments of our society who are lacking in cognitive ability should be given the tools to thrive at tasks for which they are most naturally suited, rather than being encouraged to reach beyond their potential and end up frustrated by their lack of success. That would just be mean. Also, he thinks that we should stop subsidizing birth rates among low IQ immigrant women because that will just bring down the overall intelligence of America as the population of dumb people gets bigger. It's not his fault that most of the lacking in cognitive abilities folks are black and brown, and that most of the smart people are white. That's just him reporting reality and trying to work with it, rather than against it. Not racist at all, right? Now, notice what's not being said here. What Murray never says, and what he immediately dismisses whenever he's confronted with it. Namely, the hypothesis that the racial IQ gap might be caused by the legacy of racial oppression. That's what his warning about flamboyant rhetoric about ethnic oppression was aimed at. To Charles Murray, it is unthinkable that the legacy of white supremacy could play a causal role in racial IQ performances. I mean, if you think about it, the data we have are perfectly consistent with the hypothesis that black people are actually potentially smarter than white people on average, but that something in their developmental environment is suppressing that potential. Murray dismisses this possibility out of hand every time it's presented to him. In a similar way, whenever someone points out to him that the black-white IQ gap is narrowing, Murray likes to say things like, "Yes, but that trend leveled out from X year to Y year," or "Yes, but that study ended in Z year, so we don't really know what the picture looks like today." He's also fond of saying that we've gotten all the juice we can out of improving environmental factors that might lead to a closing of the IQ gap between blacks and whites. He's called the gap a very intractable difference that has not responded to a lot of attempts to narrow it. You can listen to him doing that right here.
And you can say that that's because of cultural reasons, you can say it's because of genetic reasons, you can say it's because of a combination of both. We don't know the answer to that question, but where Dick and I guess, would draw our line in the sand and say we think the data are quite clear on this is that the wiggle room for this difference has proved to be small. It's proved to be a very intractable difference that has not responded to a lot of attempts to narrow it. And at the time we wrote the book on the race chapter, when we talked about what had been a narrowing in the 70s and 80s, but we also saw that narrowing seem to have stopped. And so we said, you know, it's a good time to reserve judgment about whether the narrowing will continue or whether it won't, because we just don't know yet. It's now been 7 years since then. If anybody knows of any data which indicates it's continuing to narrow, I'd love to hear about it. I know of some other recent data that have come out which indicates that it's not. So it is an intractable difference. It's not a result of cultural bias in the tests. It's large enough to be, it's not the kind of thing that should be ignored.
Murray never concedes the point that it's even possible for black people and white people to one day have equivalent average IQs. He will not entertain hypotheses concerning the causative role of racial oppression in racial IQ difference. He always steers his audience to the interpretation that these differences are intrinsic, intractable, and unchangeable. The main point of the bell curve is that IQ determines social outcome and status to an overwhelming degree, and that whatever its cause, IQ is an intrinsic part of who we are as both individuals and as populations. And that means, according to him, we don't need to consider what he calls flamboyant rhetoric about ethnic oppression. The massive gap in wealth between American blacks and whites that goes all the way back to the beginnings of slavery, and the millions of black people incarcerated in our country, thus have nothing to do with our history of white supremacy. Redlining, segregation, lynching, police violence, disparity in sentencing, persistent workforce discrimination, prevention often by force of the ability of black families to inherit wealth, even slavery itself, none of these things matter very much in the modern world. That's all just flamboyant rhetoric about ethnic oppression. Black people are in the situation they're in today because of factors intrinsic to themselves. They're just naturally more lacking in cognitive ability than everyone else. Is this sounding racist to you yet? Now, if you're one of the rational, skeptic, identitarian, race realist, Red Skull, Indiana Jones villains who've infested YouTube like goblins in a beginner-level dungeon, you've probably already thought, hey, maybe you should slow your roll there, you soy boy beta cuck waste of a mangina wannabe game master. This is all just Charles Murray confronting us with facts about human biodiversity. It's not his fault these facts trigger you, and the problem with your snowflake little mind, not the facts. Facts can't be racist. In fact, you're making racism worse by accusing others of racism when they're not racist at all. Or some bullcrap like that. But here's the thing. Being a skeptic is about looking for answers and fighting our own confirmation bias, not just accepting ideas at face value because they trigger the little snowflakes. When looking at something like an apparently persistent IQ gap between blacks and whites, it is profoundly unscientific to explain it by saying, that's just the way it is. Which is what Charles Murray does. He never inquires or encourages others to inquire about the mechanism behind this supposed very intractable difference. He just takes the difference at face value and behaves as though it's an immutable law of nature. And he maintains that anyone offering hypotheses to explain it that are rooted in the material conditions of white supremacy are just guilty of flamboyant rhetoric about ethnic oppression. And yet, when I started wondering about possible environmental influences on IQ, it took me about 10 minutes on Google to find something that could totally destroy Murray's premises. A single element more prevalent in black people's lives than white people's, an element that's a direct consequence of segregation, redlining, and other modern racist practices that tended to isolate black communities from white communities over the course of the 20th century. That element is, well, it's an actual element, the deadly consequences of which we've known about for centuries. It's atomic number 82, once called plum bum, and now called lead. Take a gander at this graph. It correlates childhood blood lead levels with loss of IQ points in later life. The relationship here is dose dependent, meaning the higher the exposure to lead in infancy and early childhood, the greater the decline in cognitive function as you grow up. We've known pretty much for millennia that lead is poisonous, both acutely and chronically. Chronic exposure to even trace amounts of lead in childhood is a well-studied environmental hazard, which causes not only decreased cognitive ability in adulthood, but also increases the likelihood of violent, erratic behavior. The scientific literature on the hazards of lead is extensive and comprehensive. We understand it not just as a statistical trend, but also a biological phenomenon, a causal agent in a host of behavioral and medical problems, including learning disabilities, slow growth, and skeletal deformities. Of course, none of this stopped us or the rest of the industrial world from using lead as a fuel and paint additive for most of the 20th century. I mean, for fuck's sake, we even used it as tooth fillings for cavities. Now, this collective madness inflicted its consequences on whole generations of Americans, but it did not affect all of us equally. Families who tended to live in urban areas that had high concentrations of lead in the air and soil fared worse on all of these metrics than did families who lived in the suburbs, which had lower concentrations of lead in the soil and air. Now, in case you're not getting this, let me connect some dots for you here. American black families in the 20th century, even those at the top of the economic scale, tended to live in urban areas where they experienced greater exposure to environmental lead. They tended to live in urban areas in large part because of explicitly racist segregation policies in the early part of the century, and because of redlining and other elements of systemic bias that persisted after Jim Crow was officially abolished. As a result, their kids suffered the effects of chronic lead poisoning to a greater extent than did white children, for whole generations at a time. This single fact explains away Murray's very intractable difference almost all by itself. It also explains away one of Murray's favorite retorts to his critics, the fact that black IQs are lower than whites even when socioeconomic factors are corrected for. And in case you need it all spelled out for you as bluntly as possible, lead poisoning researcher and activist Rick Nevin put together a working paper in 2012 titled Lead Poisoning and the Bell Curve. It takes apart Murray's whole premise from the ground up, applying blood lead statistics to the very same study on which Murray based most of his conclusions about racial IQ differences. It's really an awesome paper, and this quote right here should be a debate-ending mic drop, a critical success roll to anyone who actually cares about skepticism and truth-seeking more than they do about scoring points with trolls. According to Nevin, the study that provided us with the first representative data on blood lead exposure in the United States, quote, revealed another bell curve that was the mirror image of the IQ bell curve with respect to income and race. Poor children and black children are more likely to be at the high end of the blood lead bell curve and the low end of the IQ bell curve. Poor children have higher blood lead because they are more likely to live in older housing with deteriorated lead paint and with lead paint on windows that create lead-contaminated dust. Black children, regardless of income, are more likely to live in older housing and had more gas lead exposure because they were concentrated in cities where traffic increased air lead and caused more severe lead dust hazards. End quote. Seriously, go read the whole paper. It is amazing. So, how is all of this evidence that Charles Murray is racist? It's pretty simple. Murray's complete lack of curiosity about the possible underlying causes of the racial gap in IQ points to a mind shackled by a racial bias against black people. He saw the data that confirmed his biases and looked no further. That's just the way it is, was his conclusion. Other researchers looking at the same data, hell, a fucking game master looking at the same data, wondered what the mechanism of this difference might be and searched for an answer. Instead of just grabbing the conclusion of, well, blacks are just dumb and running with it, they applied skepticism and the scientific method and found something that appears to explain the whole phenomenon in the simplest way possible. That's Occam's razor, folks. In a way that doesn't lead us to conclude that blacks are intrinsically dumber than whites, and there's just nothing to be done about it. So at the very least, Murray, with the bell curve and all he's done to defend it over the years, is guilty of a profound blind spot on the subject of black intelligence. And considering how easy it is to find data that support an alternative hypothesis to his very intractable difference, one really has to wonder whether the Marshmallow Troll's teenaged cross-burning was just a youthful mistake, or the first step on a lifelong quest to slay the great dragon of the welfare state and keep all of those black people in their natural place. And if it were just the bell curve we had to work with, Murray might be able to have some plausible deniability here. He might have been able to plausibly claim that he's being misunderstood by his critics. Since the bell curve is his most well-known work, and often the only work of his audience has ever heard about, and to be honest, it is often misrepresented by its critics, Murray actually gets away with that scam pretty regularly. He gets treated as just a normal, conservative political scholar by folks like Sam Harris, because so many of them don't know the broader context. And the bell curve is part of a context, make no mistake. It's not the only book Murray's written. His other books are even worse, and one in particular really ought to be the evidence that firms up a guilty verdict of racism against him. Because it's not just terrible scholarship, laughable scholarship, honestly, but it lays his prejudices bare in a way that I don't think he intended. This other book is titled Human Accomplishment, and in it, Charlie is convinced that he's proved that only white men have ever produced anything of great cultural significance. He does this by statistically sampling how frequently important historical and cultural figures are mentioned in encyclopedias. Oh, and he cuts his sample size off in the year 1950, because nothing of any great cultural significance happened after 1950. And I'm not joking. He ends up using this methodology to produce graphs like this one, proving that white people are objectively more culturally accomplished than anyone else. Seriously, I'm not kidding with this stuff. This is real. He really did this. Imagine a serious scholar today using Wikipedia hits as a measure of cultural importance, and then expecting to still be taken seriously. There's a reason your professor scowls at you for this stuff, kids. Human Accomplishment is a fairly obscure book, but that works in Charlie's favor, because it means a lot of people don't notice how he keeps making the same kinds of cognitive mistakes, and keeps making them all in the same direction. That direction is always towards the conclusion that white people, and white men in particular, are intrinsically smarter than everyone else. All data he examines is interpreted in light of this foregone conclusion. All data that calls this conclusion into question is dismissed out of hand. This is a habit of mind, and it's called confirmation bias. And in Charlie's case, it's working to always steer him towards seeing and portraying black and brown people as lacking in cognitive ability. But Asians, you're still cool. And that's called racism, folks. It's actually a textbook case. Does Charles Murray know he's a racist? That's an open question. But we don't need to be mind readers to figure it out. We can behave like jurors and just examine the words and behavior of the defendant to reach our conclusion. And an objective, rational, skeptical look at Charlie's words and behaviors over the course of his whole adventuring career, from his appearance on Sam Harris's podcast all the way back to that wacky time he burned that cross in Iowa, point to one conclusion. Charles Murray is a racist. Full stop. Whether he knows it or not. Whether he thinks he is or not. As for Godslayer Sam Harris, well, like I said earlier, I'm agnostic at the moment. I've seen Sam change his mind in public before, and it's a process that doesn't happen overnight, and it's often subtle in real time. And in the wake of his confrontation with Ezra Klein, Sam has said that he will be bringing more black intellectuals and black historians onto his podcast because it's an important subject. So we'll see how he fares there, and his choice of guests will tell us a lot about his state of mind on this subject. I'm watching you, Sam. But for now, I'm giving Sam the benefit of the doubt, a small one, but he still gets it. And I'm thinking that he simply made a mistake born of his own confirmation bias. And in his case, the confirmation bias isn't that black people are dumb. It's that there's an identity politics-driven moral panic gripping our nation, and many legitimate scholars have gotten swept up in it unfairly and had their careers ruined. And who knows? That might even be a little bit true. But even if it is true, Charles Murray isn't one of those scholars. He remains hugely influential in both mainstream conservative policy circles and white supremacist echo chambers. The bell curve still becomes a bestseller sometimes. He's got a cushy job with a prominent think tank, and he still enjoys access to the highest halls of Washington power. He's hardly ever lost a platform in his life. The outrage surrounding him doesn't stem from his presenting us with uncomfortable facts, unless you count the uncomfortable fact that he is objectively a racist. But still, Middlebury, roughing him up like that was not cool. Save that shit for the actual Nazis. Hey there, gentle beings. Thanks for watching this, my very first YouTube video. I had a lot of fun making it, and there are more on the way. They'll probably be shorter than this one, and I hope you'll stick around to catch them. And in the meantime, remember to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in intellectual discourse with their women.